Hello, a good day from and a very warm welcome from South Africa. Um, I'm welcoming everyone on to this virtual learning community webinar, or we call it also Webinar Wednesday. I'm very excited that we have already so many people joining this webinar. We have the honor to welcome today our guest speaker, David O'Byrne from Loughborough University in the United Kingdom. I hope that everybody can hear me. Otherwise, I think I will get a message from somebody from CAC or David himself. Yeah, we won't waste any time. I will just make a few adjustments and make David a moderator as well, so he can start talking to you as he will be leading the webinar today. Again, welcome everyone, and I'm very excited to have so many people around the world joining in for this webinar. I'm sure you will be enjoying your time with David. Okay, just a few adjustments, and then we should be good to go. Yeah, again, welcome with me, David O'Byrne, PhD researcher from Loughborough University in the United Kingdom.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for the introduction. As the slide says in the front there, I'm at Loughborough University. My name is David O'Byrne. The area of research I'm focusing on my PhD is the area of using sport as a tool for development and peace. So we've quite a bit to get through in today's presentation. It should take about 40 minutes. And the general agenda is broken into three. We're going to start off with a little bit of background about me and the current research I'm doing. I'm about halfway through my PhD at the moment, so although I don't have any findings to talk about, I think it's important to recognize the kind of research that is being done at this space at the moment. The second of three parts is about the research project called Sport for a Better World, which is predominantly being run out of Loughborough and has recently just presented some initial findings and is currently going for publication. So I'll take a selection from some of the findings from that and tell you about the countries it operated in. And then the final part will be thinking about some of the issues and questions and themes that arises from today's presentation and opening it up for conversation with the group to get your thoughts. There'll be a couple of intermittent slides along the way where I'll post conversation topics or questions. I'll leave them up for about a minute or so you can get a chance to take a look at them. I'll also call them out. And as we're going, if you have any questions or comments, please do feel free to write them in the chat box in the bottom right, and then we will get to them in time as we're going through. The idea should be that we all have the opportunity to learn from each other. There's so many people around the world today who are on the practitioner side of using sport for development. So I'm very excited to hear your views on academic research and what might be done to both improve the research and improve the area of using sport for development. So very briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with Loughborough University, it was recently ranked first in the world for academic studies involving sport. What I will say is that those kind of studies are divided into two broad parts. The first part is what you might expect, which is doing research on essentially improving the performance of professional athletes and Olympians. That's not the part of the university that I'm involved in. Two sides of the same coin, I guess you might say, but on the other side, it's about how sport can be used to meet specific social goals and to make societies better. So as you might expect, given the finances involved, it's a much smaller group, but nonetheless, very, very hardworking and excited to be here talking to you today. So that's where Loughborough is based in the UK. It's in the centre of England. I'm the person on the left of that picture with the black glasses on, and there are two other PhD colleagues at Loughborough University who are also researching in similar spaces to me. And you will hear me using the phrase or the acronym Sport for Development and Peace, or SDP. Just to clarify on that point, there's a lot of different terminology around that all generally relates to the same thing, which is using sport as a means of promoting or reaching a specific social goal. So those of you who are familiar with CAC will probably use the term sport for social impact, but there's also terminology such as sport for social good, or sport for social change, or sport for development. So these can all be used interchangeably. I've been partnering with coaches across continents on my PhD research, and that's predominantly because of their reputation in using sport for social impact around the world, and their ability to provide spaces like today for people who would not otherwise be speaking or have met each other to come together and discuss issues. If you have any questions as we go as well, feel free to type them and just let me know. To provide some context for how there's PhD studies in the area of sport for development, I think this is a useful little slide that shows the growth in academic interest in the area of using sport for development over the last 15 years or so. So this research was released in 2016, and it focused on the number of pieces of published academic research that are focused on the area of using sport for social development. I think what you'll notice from the numbers is from 2001 to 2005, there was small amounts of growth, and it's really since 2005 that year on year, we've seen a huge amount of growth in terms of the investment in researchers looking at this space and the number of universities involved in this endeavor. So I'm far from the only one out there who's looking at this research area. So to give you a little bit more background, I have a couple of slides on my research, and hopefully it'll make a lot more sense to you in terms of what I'm looking at. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as well once I get through them. So in general, that slide that I've just shown on the tremendous growth in the academic interest in research in this area has tended to focus on the programs and NGOs and activities of organizations emanating from the United States or from Europe, and looking at programs that they're operating or funding or supporting in some way in South America or in Africa, across the continent of Africa. My research is looking at it a slightly different way, in that I'm trying to highlight the underexplored or even unexplored areas. So I'm trying to look at diverse activists who are involved in creating and managing sport for development programs who haven't previously been researched. And by doing this, what I'm hoping to show is that there's knowledge that's moving around the world through the use of sport for development, and it goes across these borders of the global north and the global south. So just to explain that terminology, there's two kind of simplified maps there. The rich north and the poor south is to highlight what's that divide in terms of economic financial might of the countries involved across that global north-south equator. The map on the left has a little bit more detail in that it comes from the International Monetary Fund, and how they've divided out the orange countries are those with GDP per capita below $10,700, and the blue countries, which is the global north in general, is above $10,700. I'm just seeing the question here from Eric about Haiti. I haven't specifically focused on Haiti, Eric, but what you'll see with my research is that I'm trying to understand how people and the efforts in Haiti might also be influencing programs that are happening in the global north or elsewhere around the world. So my research and why I'm doing it. Obviously, the overarching goal is about continuing to improve how sport can be used to help create better societies. I also want to use my research to give recognition for how diverse the people are behind using sport for development. And in many of my case studies, which I'll give you a little sample of later, you'll see the number of migrants involved in not just receiving programs as participants, but in terms of conceptualizing, managing, leading programs. What I'd like to do is demonstrate the power of bringing together these diverse knowledge collaborations, and then try and take lessons of how SDP and the work it's doing could also help the broader development sector. So the sector that doesn't necessarily include sport and may focus on other areas such as health or economics or education. So how I'm working with CAC? Well, the fact that most of you are on a CAC webinar right now means that you're probably familiar with the organization. The part of the organization I'm working with most is Marcus and his online education platform. So Marcus and the OEP team basically provide a virtual space for attendees to take part in a 9-month training program. So these attendees come from countries all over the world, and they come to CAC to learn what a sport for development is about, how to better do it, but ultimately over the course of the program, they share their own knowledge with each other and with coaches across continents so that we all benefit. Again, pointing to the fact of examples of how knowledge is also flowing from countries in the global south and helping the operations of other programs, whether they be in the global south or the global north. So this is the slide that gives a little bit more context about the kind of organizations I'm working with and the people involved. So on the left-hand side, you see the logo for Football for Hope, Peace and Unity. This is an organization that's led by Eric Murwangwa. Eric is a great example of this flow of global knowledge because Eric is a Rwandan. He's actually a former Rwandan national team goalkeeper. And Eric was persecuted during the genocide in Rwanda and ultimately escaped to Europe and now lives in London. From his experiences, where he literally attributes his teammates as saving his life, so his connections through sport and football were what allowed him to escape during the genocide. Eric believes that sport is a great tool for promoting values around social inclusion and fighting discrimination of all kinds. Eric, importantly, now operates programs not only in Rwanda, but also in London. So we're seeing examples of how someone from a migrant background from Africa is now implementing his own ideas in programs in London and how they differ from other programs from people who may not have the same experiences of Eric. The middle program is an organization called Sport Against Racism Ireland. So I'm from Ireland originally, and I spent a lot of the summer collecting data with this organization in Ireland. They have a whole host of programs operating, but what's particularly interesting about this organization, SARI, is how they've built into their model the idea of promoting youth leaders who can then conceptualize their own programs, identify their own social issues that they want to address, and then be given support to create their own programs and manage them as they see fit. So what we've seen from this is programs such as the middle picture in SARI, which is a girls' football team, and the name of the program is Hijabs and Hat-Tricks. So essentially, some Muslim youth leaders who are all either migrated to Ireland from Africa, various African countries, as young children, or some of them were actually born in Ireland. And they identified a need of a safe space for Muslim girls, and ultimately girls of all faiths and religions, or no faith, to come together and play football in a safe space. SARI also have a host of other programs operating that aren't just targeted towards girls, but are also targeted towards young men. And they're very successful because of the fact that the people running the programs tend to be from a migrant background. They're very successful at activating new migrants in Ireland who may be struggling with social inclusion and questions around their identity and citizenship, and getting them involved in the sports programs they're operating. I just see a message coming in from Ken McHugh, who's the cultural planner at SARI in Ireland. And Ken is the person who introduced me to the organization. And I spent a lot of time with Ken this summer. So thanks again to Ken for giving me access to the organization and the wonderful people there. And then finally, in terms of partnerships, on the top right, you'll see Coaches Across Continents. I've mentioned to you already in terms of the online education program that I am working with Marcus on and the participants there. So again, creating a virtual space for people to come together and exchange knowledge in terms of how to improve sport for development. But it's important to understand knowledge as being more than just content knowledge. It's just about learning information, but it's about recognizing different people from around the world and the way they see the world and the processes and practices that they prioritize. And that can often give you more insights than any content knowledge that's being passed on to you. So these organizations, as the box shows there, give me access to a range of organizations of different size and scale and scope in terms of the sports they use, in terms of the funding they might attract, and in terms of the social goals they're trying to address. So this is really just to summarize my PhD process at the moment. I've started by trying to focus on organizations where we're seeing knowledge moving from different places around the world across the global south, or from the global south to the global north. And then you're trying to magnify and focus on people's experiences in these programs and how they're going about promoting social inclusion or confronting intolerance of all kinds. The idea behind it is then, when I collect my findings, that I will be able to take tangible pieces that can help improve how STP is currently operating and build into theories of change and development. And also importantly, particularly, I know we have some people from the UK on the webinar, something that you see in the UK media particularly is the view of migrants as being a burden and as somehow a problem that needs to be managed. And instead, what my research is showing is the power of migrants to contribute to societies in ways that currently aren't being investigated, and to improve the societies that they're living in. So the final slide on my PhD progress before we go into part 2 of the presentation is I want to give you an idea on what I'm doing in terms of day-to-day. And why I want to do this is a lot of people here are program practitioners. So I want to give you a sense in terms of what it's like to work with a researcher in your project. So in general, my research is qualitative. And what that really breaks down to is it involves spending a lot of time with the organizations. So you do need to develop a relationship with the organizations where they give you access to the programs that they're operating, that they're comfortable in speaking with you frankly. So I've conducted more than 25 interviews across the 3 case studies thus far, but that number is still growing. As I said, I'm in the midst of my research right now. I think it's also important to point out that while there are recorded interviews, which tend to be a little more structured, there's also just a lot of time spent together in conversation, which is where you can pick up a lot of insights as well. And you'll see there that I also mention photo elicitation. Essentially, what this means is giving a space for research participants to be able to direct conversation. So participants in my research bring along their own pictures, and that gives them a space to point out to me what they think is important, and that can be about their own lives, about changes they've seen in their own lives, about the Sport for Development organization they're involved with. So the conversation point from this first block of three, this is part one complete. I just want to ask you all listening in today, I'd love you to get involved and let me know if you have any examples of programs where people of diverse backgrounds have become program creators or leaders in new spaces. So programs that are operating where the people behind it may not be seen as being from the home country, and what kind of differences do you see in those programs in terms of the benefits that might accrue and also the challenges in order to allow this to happen. So I will give you a minute to post any comments that you like on this first conversation point, and I'll take a look at the questions that you've already posted and get back to you as well. So let me just, if we all take a minute. So I'm looking at Wallace's question. In your research for Sports for Development, did you consider support to grassroots organizations in poor countries to drive the program that you can also share? So Wallace, if I understand your question, I think that the usual model that has been looked at in research is, as I was mentioning, those organizations such as NGOs from Europe and the US who do provide funding to local organizations in poorer countries, in developing countries. So that is actually how things tend to happen. So my research hasn't focused on that, but there is a lot of other research out there that does look at that. What I will accept that there are a lot of issues with that in terms of whether these NGOs from Europe and North America may want to operate their own programs in developing countries, and whether that causes problems or excludes some local grassroots community organizations. I don't know if that's a problem that you've come across, or if that's something that you may have experienced and be hinting at. I'd be interested to hear more. Judith asks about my thoughts on the power of migrants. Would like to know more. Judith, I guess like anything, it depends on the individual. What I would say in general, in terms of the migrant youth that I've spoken to in terms of my research so far, obviously I'm speaking to people who are involved in sport for development organizations, not those who may have lost their way or not be involved in any kind of volunteering activities. But what I would say is, from the experiences that I've heard so far, they tend, the people behind these organizations are incredibly enthusiastic, incredibly passionate, and some of the most active, driven people that I've come across. So I would say that giving migrants a space where they're not just participants in a program, but are given that freedom to create and develop their own ideas is an important point in terms of unlocking potential. I don't know if that answers your question, but again, feel free to follow up. The photo elicitation, let me know if you do want more detail on that. I did kind of explain why I used that and what's involved. Vincent, the program manager is from the UK, Ireland, and running a project in Southern Africa. Yeah, okay, so Vincent, that's a good example of Global North, the Global South. So a similar background to myself, someone from Ireland is running a program in South Africa. And the programs that I'm looking at are looking at the opposite of migrants who've come predominantly from Africa and are running programs in UK and Ireland. And I'm trying to show that there is definitely a blend there, that we need to explore that relationship more fully. I'm a little bit worried on time. I do appreciate all your questions. What I'll do is I will continue on with the next block, because I'm just worried about finishing in 40 minutes or so. We have about 20 minutes left. So let me continue on with the next block, and then I will come back to your questions. So the next block is about the Sport for a Better World project. So this is a project that the research has recently been concluded on. It lasted several years. It was a project predominantly run from Loughborough University, but with some support from the University of Toronto. And the goal of the project was to look at the future of STP in terms of how better impacts can be achieved, best practices improved, and what the possibilities are for the future of sport for development. Its main research pillars, as you would expect at the start of a project, were incredibly broad, and they looked at areas of human rights, of peace, and of social justice. But for today's project, or for today's presentation, I'm focusing in on four quite small areas because of timing. And I'm going to look at the area of the structure of SDP organizations, the leadership within the SDP sector, the role of volunteers, and striving for gender equality through SDP. So these I will provide a little bit more in detail on in terms of what the academics have found. So what's important to also take away from this study is, again, speaking of the growth of research in this area, it was a comparative study conducted across 5 countries over several years. So those 5 countries are listed there. So again, it shows that the researchers are going to very diverse spaces. So we have Kosovo, Jamaica, Sri Lanka, Rwanda, and Zambia. And some of the findings that were of interest to me and I'd like to share with you today are these areas. So across the 5 countries, the structure of these organizations that are operating sport for development, what the researchers found was the organizations tend to be very well connected to global funders or NGOs. And this makes sense in terms of that's where so many of them are reliant on the money to run their organization. But there seemed to be a lack in terms of organizations that have local or regional connections with other organizations who may be also using sport for development or using non-sporting means to meet a similar social goal. So the question they're asking about the future for sport for development is, as the industry continues to grow, is there a need for more national action planning? And should this involve more government support for the use of sport for development and intergovernmental organizations in terms of both funding, but also in terms of structuring and planning, so that organizations and the people behind them would be in a better position to be able to learn from each other and potentially to create a better form of development. The second area is about the leadership within sport for development. So what they found is that NGOs are almost entirely responsible for implementing the work that is happening in sport for development. And that, to go back to one of the earlier questions, can include grassroots organizations right up to the big multinational NGOs that are operating in dozens of countries across the world. The benefits of this is that NGOs can be politically neutral, so they can operate outside of government objectives or political tendencies, political leanings. But the downside is certainly that these NGOs are incredibly stretched, and they're stretched in terms of the funding they're trying to operate on. They're stretched in terms of having the staff to actually get involved with the networking in point 1 that they were asking them to do, to become more involved with other organizations locally and regionally. They, as I said, they're entirely responsible for the implementation of all the work, and there's a lot of demands on them in terms of monitoring and evaluation, particularly when they have to prove to funders what it is they're delivering and what the impacts have been. What they're suggesting is that some of these findings across the 5 countries, NGOs are struggling with balancing fast impacts, so essentially demonstrating the value of their work in a period of 3 months or even 6 months, versus the ideas they have about what long-term social change will look like, but not necessarily having the funding to support those ideas and not being able to put them into practice. The final point is about whether NGOs have become too isolated from public policy. So again, is there a role for more government intervention in terms of outlining a policy at regional and national and international levels, particularly as sport for development as a sector is trying to get more legitimacy at these levels and to prove its worth. The final two areas we're looking at is volunteering and gender. So volunteering is interesting because, again, there's a benefit to having so many local volunteers involved in these programs across the world. The benefit is that the local volunteers are bringing crucial local knowledge and experiences and community connections that most definitely help support the program and the work they're doing. However, there's also a potential question over how over-reliant sport for development is on unpaid people. Particularly, as we mentioned earlier, it's a sector that's trying to prove its legitimacy and its sustainability. So can you be sustainable in terms of growing and providing more offerings and more programs, and how much stress you can put on local volunteers? There may also be a danger that you end up losing some of the most talented people from sport for development if their position is unpaid volunteer, and there may be other development areas such as health or economics or education that very often pay their employees. And finally, in the area of gender, and just seeing a question coming in from Emily there about the passion that volunteers have, I think that's definitely something that we have to be careful about, is that if you make positions paid, is there a danger that you start losing the most passionate people? So the balance between attracting the right people, but then also maintaining them and helping them stay in the sector. In the area of gender, what the researchers noticed across the countries they studied was that there's a disconnect between saying that sport for development is open to participation and access to both genders, but access does not always lead to engagement. And what they found was that very often where there are girls engaged in sport, one of the primary motivators is having coaches and people in managerial roles in the organizations who are females. So they provide a role model for young women and the comfort level in terms of them engaging. So there's more work that needs to be done for sport for development organizations to recognize the social and cultural pressures, but recognize them from a specific gendered point of view. And also there's calls for the SDP organizations to work alongside other bodies who are maybe non-sport stakeholders, would have more expertise in gender equality. And that again could be through areas such as education, health, and human rights work. So to kind of borrow from organizations that have more expertise in the area of gender equality. So these slides, I'm sure Marcus will have available after the presentation. I've included links here to where you can access more findings from this research project. There was a series of podcasts recorded by the Commonwealth in London from one of the research presentations. And there's also other links there to the Loughborough website. And about that podcast that happened in London at the Commonwealth Secretariat, I think it's an interesting point to note that the presentations were not just from the academics who traveled around the 5 countries doing the research, but it also included program leaders from the programs that were researched. So part of the budget that they managed to make happen in this particular project was to fly in those program leaders from each of the countries, so that people at the symposium on the day we're hearing the view both from the program leaders and from the academics who had been analyzing their work. And it led to a much better interaction in terms of having the program leaders offer you insights from different points of view in different areas, and also being able to hear some of the research that had been found, some of the findings that had already taken place, and were there to agree or disagree with particular parts of it. So they are available from that website link I included. One of the suggestions at this event was also whether there's a need to include practitioners as part of future research teams. So again, this would mean that as well as an academic traveling to spend time with a particular project or projects, you would take a practitioner from another program so that they might be able to offer the views from a more hands-on day-to-day reality point of view, and whether this would generate very different research findings. Again, the problem with making this happen is timing and money, in terms of someone having the time to work into a particular research project, and then also being able to have the finances to cover their costs and make payments. But it's certainly something that needs to be considered. So the conversation points from this area, have the people on this webinar, have you worked with university researchers before? If you haven't, why not? Is it because of your own choice, or that you just never had the opportunity? And then, what was the experience like of working with researchers? Did you see benefits from it? Were there challenges in including researchers in your project's work? And also, has the research that did take place with your organizations, has it returned any findings that were useful to your organization in terms of things that you were able to actually implement? Or were they more theoretical elements that you felt couldn't be implemented because of other day-to-day constraints that you're facing? So if you take a minute to think about those questions and type up answers, or indeed comments, and I will flick back through some of the comments that have been coming through while I've been speaking. I'm delighted to see that there have been so many comments coming through. I'm just trying to catch up as quick as I can. So I see Samuel's comment about how successfully incorporating people from different ethnic backgrounds in their YES project in Kenya, which is exciting to hear. I'd certainly love to hear more from Samuel. I will put up my contact details at the end of this presentation, so if people need to get in contact with me. Sorry, starting to lose my voice. I've had a cold for the last couple of days. So there's lots of other examples that are coming through, which I'm excited to read about. Ken McHugh from Sport Against Racism Ireland also mentions another element of their work, which is called Sport Aid from Africa to Ireland, something that they call reverse aid, which is a part of their work that I haven't even had time to go into today, but it's another good example. The comments are just jumping around because there's some new comments coming through. So I'm glad to see there's a conversation taking place in the chat box while I'm talking. I know you guys are getting a little bit more time to read it instead of me just speaking. So I do hope that you're managing to learn as much as I am from you, and that you're getting a chance to learn from each other's comments. Yeah, Marcus has just sent me a message as well, asking if he would. I'd like him to respond to any questions. Because Marcus has had a chance to read the questions as they're coming through. I'll pass over the audio to Marcus before I do the quick wrap up on my presentation today. So Marcus, if you would like to come over and address some of the comments and questions that have been coming through, that would be great.
Okay, yeah, I hope everybody can hear me now. Yeah, it's been really amazing also to read all these comments, and I can certainly understand, David. I've been in the situation where you present and you don't know where to look first, because you want to focus on your presentation, but you don't want to miss out on any comments. And there have certainly been a lot of comments today. So yeah, thank you very much for everybody participating. But I wanted to address a little bit. I've taken a couple of notes on the previous section where we talked a little bit about the challenges and advantages of having a non-native or non-local running a program, and there have been or having a leadership position, and there have been some great comments. Alma mentioned one of the challenges that might be is language. If you probably don't speak the local language that is spoken by the majority of your participants or colleagues or members of your organization. So that can definitely be a challenge that can probably also go both ways, global north to the global south and the other way around as well. Although I think it's more a challenge for people from the global north going to the global south because of the history. A lot of people in the global south speak languages from European countries. Other aspects that have been mentioned, Vince from South Africa mentioned some of the challenges that you might face is to finding local capacity for running your program, and I think that might lead a little bit to what David said at the beginning when he spoke about the IGP. I'm not sure if I'm using the shortcut correctly, but basically the financial strength of the different countries, where I think that's also one of the reasons why when it comes to finances, they are lacking behind compared to the global north, because the capital is just not there to that amount and to that extent as it is in the global north. Another aspect, or two other aspects, was local politics and gaining trust from people. I think that's something that I think probably face everywhere in the world when you are coming into a leadership position. That is something to understand local circumstances and gaining trust from local people. I think that's something we are facing also now in the global north, seeing with the refugees that are coming, that there is very little trust towards those people. So yeah, I think that's very helpful feedback on that side. And a positive an advantage that Vince shares was that access to resources that might not be available to locals. That might be also interesting to look a little bit closer. How is it for people, for let's say refugees or foreigners coming into global north? Can they access money or funding that is not available to locals? So that might be an interesting aspect as well. And I think one last one that I've written down was from Alma, talking about the general challenge, and I think that's not only related to a non-native coming into a leadership position, is that a lot of people concentrate a lot on winning and losing instead of the social aspect of the game, of the program, of the initiatives. I think that's probably a global topic and issue when it comes to sports and when it comes to competition. Okay, that's so far what I've been able to collect. David is just asking me if we should cut the last part. I think what I would suggest, David, you've probably been able to catch up on some of the comments. If you want to do that and then briefly go through the last points, I think that's a 5 minute thing to wrap up the last part. I think the participants would appreciate that, and then have probably the final round of questions. I think we can go for another 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll be done. Thank you.
Okay, so there's just a few more slides to run through, and as I mentioned at the outset, these are slides that draw on particular themes that we've been discussing today, and ask a few more questions that make us reflect and think about what could be done. So the table on the left, if I explain it to you, again comes from this research published last year that aggregated all the studies in the area of sport for development. And what you'll see is, in terms of the sports that are used in the sector, by far and away the biggest individual sport is football, which quite rightly, football has its place as the most popular sport in the world. It makes sense that it's the most used sport in sport for development. However, it might be worth asking the question if there's kind of a default status to using football and whether we're overly focused on it. There could be that we're missing engagement opportunities by defaulting to football, and then instead, if we think of new sports or new physical activities, whether they're local or regional games, or even just making up entirely new games, that we might be able to better engage with different gender bases and different levels of ability or disability, or indeed people of different ethnic backgrounds who may be new to a country and not understand the local sports. So that's just really a thought that I'm throwing out there. The last three slides kind of all do this. This research, again, if I draw your attention to the pie chart, I'll explain that this was a period of 14 years, and there's particular social goals that programs focused on in terms of programs that were covered by researchers. So if we look at the blue 5% at the top, and we look at the bright green 3% on the right, there are two issues that we've kind of been touching on today in terms of the gender problem of actually trying to achieve gender equality through sport, and the criticism as to whether we're actually managing to engage young women and girls in sports programs. And disability is also another issue in terms of how successful the sector has been at this. So again, there's question marks around what kind of sports we should use and how they should take place to make sure that we continue to address some of the emerging social goals that sport for development has been tasked with. And this is the final content slide, so we're almost there. I'll explain the box on the right. Essentially, this looks at different levels of development that programs have focused on. So if you look at community, by far and away, the biggest number is 256, which very much reflects the fact that sport for development is very local focused. And while that may be a good thing, you also have to then ask questions about how sport for development could be used to tackle problems that are probably more suited to national and international level interventions. So the example that I put on the slide here is the problem around environmental protection, environmentalism. Is that something that we can continue to tackle in a fragmented way at a community level? Or is there need for a more aggregated way of having sport for development organizations work together at national and even international levels to tackle issues like this? So the final conversation slide, and this is the final slide of the presentation, was to ask you all what kind of barriers or opportunities you've seen for researchers and practitioners to work together better. maybe if you could think about even one of these three questions and let me know your views, that would be great. The second area was about whether you see a need for SDP to start operating at national and international levels, or do you have views as to why it's important to keep it at a community level? And the final question is about, do you see a need for SDP programs, or indeed SDP researchers, to change in order to better tackle issues such as gender or disability? So I'm going to flick back over to some of the more recent comments and questions coming through, and I'll address whatever I can. Samuel talked about how he's introduced netball and handball to cater for girls. However, handball did not pick up since the girls felt that it was too physical and could cause them injuries. So yeah, I think that's very important. I know it's something that SARI have done successfully as well, is to actually ask girls who are and aren't involved in your organization what kind of activities they might feel comfortable in participating in, and go from there. Start building out programs around what they have said they would like to take part in. So it's good to see that Samuel's on top of that with the netball. Jorge has talked about how they've worked with parents and tried to build capacity, I guess, in the methodology of sport for social impact. Okay, so that's another example of how not just working with the children or the youth at a community level, but also working intergenerationally, which I didn't even have on the slide, which is another big challenge in the area. It's just a little hard to read the comments because there's, as each new comment comes in, it changes the page view. Ken has talked about the dropout rates in girls aged 14, 16. And of course, the whole other area that hasn't come up in today's presentation, the importance of vetting coaches who are working with juveniles to make sure that safeguarding processes are in place. There's a lot of questions, so I'm hoping you're getting to read each other's questions as well, and thoughts, because there's a lot of good comments coming in. Vicky's talked about the need for international work and to make sure that the wheel isn't being reinvented all the time, that we do learn from each other and figure out best practices and pass that information on. So, I mean, that is certainly some of the findings that have suggested that there is greater need for integration at a national and international level, while also respecting the differences across communities, and that there does need to be a core community action base who understand local issues. So I definitely think there is a balance there. I'm seeing some comments coming through from Lynn in terms of the benefits of communal. Communal is the increase of voice, and the challenges is the relay of the information on a policy level. So yeah, absolutely, communication is always going to be an issue. That it's fine to agree that we need things done at a national or international level, but then the structures and frameworks that need to be in place to make sure that policy is built on a truly representative view from all these countries and communities is definitely a challenge, which kind of brings us back to the whole area of Millennium Development Goals and sustainable development goals, in terms of whose voices are we hearing and when we're creating these goals. There's a lot of questions coming in. I know some people have to head off, so I do appreciate your time because we've gone a little bit over the 45-minute mark. So those of you who are heading off, thank you very much for joining today. I will put up just my contact details on this truly final slide. So for those of you who do want to engage in more conversation, feel free to either email me, or my Twitter handle is there as well. If you want to tweet me, we can certainly connect on Twitter. Yeah, so there's mostly thank yous coming in now, which once again, it was my pleasure to be here today, but thank you all for both tuning in and then being so active in putting forward your views and questions. Yes, Juan is asking if the presentation will be available. I'm sure Marcus will make the presentation available on the Coaches Across Continents EduDip page, where anyone who's registered for today's session should be able to access the slides.
Yeah, if I may quickly
Okay.
jump in on that, David. Yeah, so the presentation will be available to be downloaded from EduDip, or where you have registered for the webinar or registered your account. If you go to that page, you will be able to access that presentation. So yeah, that will definitely be available. I hope I haven't silenced you, David.
I'm
But
here, but yeah, no, I'm
okay,
happy for you to
cool.
wrap up.
Yeah, yeah. Let me. Yeah, I would like to say thank you to David, and I don't know how you all feel, but my brain is definitely filled with many new information. It feels like it's still buzzing, and there's a lot of things to think about it and process. I think there was a lot of input over the past 55 minutes. Um, yeah, and I think I want to just say thank you to everyone who joined in, and it was an absolute pleasure to have you speaking today, David. I think we will make research and collaboration between researchers and practitioners a topic for one of the next webinars, because I think there's so much more to dive in and to share. And I was blown away by the input and feedback we got throughout the past 55 minutes from all the participants. So yeah, please follow up with more details with David through his email address, or follow him on Twitter. And as mentioned previously, we will make the presentation available on EduDip, so you can download it and also then access the web links that have been provided by David. Thank you very much for joining in. Thank you very much for staying a little bit longer. And thank you, David, for presenting to us today. Have a good day. Goodbye, and see you soon. Next month,
Okay,
we'll
goodbye
be
from me too.
presenting and preparing for World AIDS Day in December. Thank you.